everybody. We're going to get started. Thanks for being here. We're really happy to share with you tonight. To just give a roadmap for tonight, everyone is muted. Please stay on mute. This is a big Zoom. We haven't done a big Zoom like this since the beginning of the pandemic. So everyone, please stay on mute. Please stay on mute. And if you have a question for the panel and the panelists, you can submit that question using the chat function to the hosts. And to just give a roadmap of where we're going tonight, we are going to do a quick introduction to our delegation, why we went to Vienna. We're going to have a conversation about what social housing is from Oksana Mironova at the Community Service Society. And then we're going to do a panel moderated by Oksana with members of our delegation. And we're going to close out hearing from different pathways, to fight for social housing in New York State. So we're really excited to share with you tonight. We encourage you to follow along on social media using the hashtag #OurHomesOurPower. I'm going to go ahead and drop that in the chat. And without further ado, I am going to get started. And I want to just thank you all again for joining us tonight. Let me just go ahead and find my slides. All right. Okay. So welcome to our presentation. My name is Sia Weaver, and I'm the campaign coordinator of Housing Justice for All. We're a statewide coalition of about 80 grassroots housing justice organizations from all over New York State. And we came together in 2017, and we've been building power all over New York to fight for stronger tenants' rights and housing as a human right in New York. Just to frame our conversation today, I want to share a little bit about New York's housing crisis. This will be familiar to anyone who lives in New York. It's been harder and harder to afford the rent. Rents are going up in every part of the state at alarming amounts. Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, Syracuse, Yonkers, people are seeing rent spikes every month in their paycheck. The crisis is because our profit-driven housing system is just not working. The majority of tenants last year, 57%, saw huge rent increases, and the median asking rent in Manhattan is well over $4,000 now. Homelessness is higher than any time since the Great Depression. 74,000 people right now are homeless in New York State. And over 104,000 students in our public school system experience homelessness at some time during the school year. More than 260,000 households across the state are facing eviction. And the truth is that market-based solutions can't solve this crisis. People want to believe that this crisis is inevitable and that there's nothing that we can do to get out of it. But that's not true. We know that's not true. And we know that we can't solve the housing crisis by turning once again to the private market. We wanted to expand our imagination and look to other models beyond New York, like Vienna, to think about how to solve the housing crisis. And we don't think that the model in Vienna is perfect, but we wanted to go there because we wanted to learn about this world-renowned social housing program that's been in existence for, over 100 years. We're going to learn a little bit more about the model tonight. These are some photos of some of the public housing that we toured in Vienna on our trip there. We wanted to understand its limitations. We're going to talk more about this, but Vienna is an exclusionary society, and it's not a perfect social housing system, and we didn't go there with any illusions that it was. But we wanted to help build a social housing vision for New York, and we wanted to be inspired by what exists in other places to help steel us for the tough fight against the New York real estate industry that is before us. Winning social housing or something like it in New York is going to be a struggle. Real estate in New York is like oil in Texas, right? But we know that we have a really powerful housing movement here, and we're excited to start taking steps forward to building a new system. So in October of 2022, we took a delegation to Vienna. This is our delegation. We're here at Karl Marxhof, which we're going to hear long about. But Karl Marx Hof, amongst its many other incredible qualities, is the longest residential building in Europe. And it was built during the period of municipal socialism during Red Vienna. We took a delegation of 50 tenants, homeless New Yorkers, organizers, policy researchers, and elected officials. And we had an incredible transformative experience there, touring social housing developments, municipally planned neighborhoods like the one where Karl Marx Hof is. And we spoke with policy experts, party organizers, racial justice organizers, and immigration activists, government officials, social housing developers, and residents about what the housing system is like in Vienna. Throughout, we were asking questions of each other about, what we were learning, how it is and is different from what we have in New York State, and how we can bring what we like about it back here to New York. And tonight we're going to share some of those lessons with you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Oksana, who's going to take us through an introduction to social housing.
Hey everyone, and thanks so much, Sia. My name is Oksana Mironova. I'm a housing policy analyst at the Community Service Society of New York, and I was lucky enough to go on this delegation in October with 50 other wonderful people. So before we get into the Viennese example specifically, I wanted to introduce the concept of social housing because it may not be obvious or familiar to some of the people who are on this call right now. So when we talk about social housing, it's sort of a nebulous term that doesn't have a specific definition in the US, in other parts of the world, including Vienna, but also in other parts of Europe and Asia, in Latin America, there's legally defined social housing developments. But when we talk about social housing in the US, we're really talking about a system that has three different attributes. The first one being some level of decommodification, which basically means that the housing is removed and shielded from the market in some way. The second aspect is social equality, where there's a level of integration by race, by class, and by other attributes. And the third is resident control, where the residents in the building or in the development have actual real impact on what happens in the building, how the building is managed, and also the long-term future of the building. So if you're a tenant in just in an apartment in New York, most of the time, you really don't have a say of what happens with the building long-term, and with resident control, you would. And we're going to show you a wonderful video now that kind of goes into this a little bit more.
Imagine never having to worry. Imagine if your home wasn't a source of anxiety. Imagine never having to worry about rent going up or repairs getting done, about getting evicted, or where your kids will sleep at night. Instead, imagine your home as a place just for rest, for family, for community. That's the home that Housing Justice for All is fighting for with the Our Homes, Our Power campaign. Our Home starts with a basic foundation. It's governed by the people. It's not there to line the pockets of a developer. It's funded through public investment. And because of that, Our Home is deeply and permanently affordable. In Our Home, residents have power and control. It's democratically managed by the people who live in it instead of some faraway landlord investor. Our Home is universally accessible. We want housing for everybody, no matter who you are or where you're from. Many of us have been left behind by our current housing system, and that needs to change. Our Home is safe and beautiful. We deserve not only decent, but beautiful living conditions. Nice, well-designed homes shouldn't just be for the wealthy. This is the home we are fighting for. Public, affordable, universal, safe, beautiful, and controlled by us. The Our Homes, Our Power campaign isn't just about digging us out of the housing crisis we face today. Together, we are transforming the profit-driven housing market from the ground up and building towards a future of social housing, one where we can all have the home we are fighting for. Join the fight.
Cool. That's the video. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the Viennese model specifically. The important thing to understand about the Viennese social housing model is that it goes back to 1919 and starts with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this is a system that's been in place for over 100 years. And gets its beginning in something called the Red Vienna moment, where out of the ashes of an empire rose a municipal government, specifically within Vienna, that was on the same track for a very short time with Austria as a whole, but then really developed on its own. Where there was a municipal socialist government that came out of an organized worker struggle that put in a bunch of socialist systems within housing, but also outside of housing, everything from childcare to worker education and everything else within the city of Vienna. And the government was able to build more than 60,000 apartments before 1934. Where there was a domestic fascist government that rose within Austria first, before it was annexed to Nazi Germany at the beginning of World War II. As you can imagine, the Austro-fascists didn't like the socialist government, didn't like the socialist policies, and we all know what happened next. World War II, Vienna was devastated through this period of time, and not going to get into the history of World War II. I think that we all know what happened there. And the important thing is that the city was bombed aerially, and a lot of the housing stock was lost. In a little bit after 1945, so the Allies won, the city elected another socialist government and put in a welfare state system where a lot of the reconstruction that was done was to build more public housing. So a ton of public and social housing was built in the 50s and 60s, and the welfare state that started developing in the 20s sort of took off. The city did go through a neoliberal turn, similar to the US, similar to other cities that are more analogous in Europe, but it happened a little bit later. And by that point, social housing was such an established part of the Social Democratic Party's platform and the city's identity that it just wasn't decimated to the same extent as what happened in London or Berlin or other cities around Vienna that also had really big social housing stocks. Next slide, please. When we visited Vienna, we learned a bunch of things that were pretty surprising to me, and I think surprising to other people on the trip as well. So the vast majority of the housing stock in Vienna is under some sort of either within the social housing stock or thanks. It's either social housing or it's under a pretty strict form of rent control that's much stronger than what we have in New York City. Residents pay on average 20% of their income in rent. That's way lower than what we have in New York or in any American city. And the vast majority of residents of the city live in social housing, up to 70%. The housing is really high quality, and people want to live in social housing. And this was probably the most shocking thing to me, is that as you live in a building for a longer period of time, rents eventually go down. And because of the way that municipal housing companies are set up in Vienna. Next slide. And there are three main housing types that we learned about when we were on the trip that are present within the Viennese system. The one that's most analogous to the US is the for-profit model. It's everything you can imagine, owned by private companies. The prices are set by the market. They're basically unregulated apartments, just like anywhere else in the world. Then there's a stock of about 200,000 municipally or publicly owned apartments. And those are administered by an agency that we could say is really analogous to NYCHA if NYCHA was never disinvested and was always fully funded going back to its inception. And then the third type is the limited profit housing managed by limited profit housing associations, which are private entities that are really, really tightly controlled by the government and that are really heavily regulated. And these are most analogous to our Mitchellama co-ops. The rents are based on how much the operational cost of the development. So they're not based on the market, they're based on how much it actually costs to run a building. Most interestingly, the surplus that a building makes is reinvested into the housing system into the pocket of a landlord. Next slide, please. We learned a bunch about the key mechanisms that make the Viennese model work. I should say upfront that it's not like we could take any of these and kind of like plug it into the New York City or New York State system, and then suddenly everything's going to be analogous to the way that things work in Vienna. But I do think that there's a lot here that we could learn from. So there's an overall commitment to providing high quality housing for the workforce. And this is coming from a kind of like an interesting corporatist relationship between labor, which is extremely strong within the city, and the business sector. So basically, there's an understanding that in order for businesses to be able to pay workers a little bit less, you have to provide cheap housing. So there's kind of this agreement there, and we saw a bunch of tension, and we could talk a little bit more about that. The maintenance of the social housing system is a key priority for the Social Democratic Party, which has been in power for ever since the Nazis were defeated in 1945. So it's been kind of like the party, the people have changed, but because it's a parliamentary system, the party has been in power and has been able to kind of like keep the social housing system going. And the idea of like the Social Democratic Party suddenly deciding that they're going to privatize a bunch of this housing was like really not something that would be okay. Everyone would get voted out if that was the decision that was made. So it's part of the party's identity. There's also a really robust welfare state beyond housing. So people don't have to depend on their housing to be like their retirement fund or an emergency funds, because all of that stuff exists outside of the housing system. And there's really strong rent control and tenancy laws, which impact the land costs and make it more possible for great social housing to be built, because land is not speculated on, or speculated on much less. There's a housing income tax, which has been around for a very long time, that everyone pays, or that employers pay from everyone's paychecks, and that's an ongoing housing subsidy that helps the city build its own housing. So there is like a revenue stream that's around and always there. There's a land bank that's controlled by the city that's been around since 1984. And it controls enough land to actually set land policy. So the way that the city develops isn't controlled by private developers, but this land bank is able to say, we're going to develop this neighborhood and we're going to plan this neighborhood in the way that we want to plan it. And the planning happens on an actual community-wide scale, not a deal by deal zoning situation where like a lot is rezoned and then there has to be a fight about it. Like things happen on the neighborhood level. And the zoning code mandates that 2/3 of new development should be social housing, which is obviously not something that we have here. At the same, can you go forward one slide? Yeah, cool, thank you. At the same time, there's a bunch of limitations as well, right? Like we can't imagine that Vienna is like a utopia. Austria is a racist society. It is one of the strictest citizenship requirements in Europe. And it's really, really difficult to immigrate to Austria and to legalize as an immigrant once you get there. The refugee policy is terrible. The country is mostly unwilling to take refugees. And it's a society that is actively struggling with its fascist past and have seen, just like other places in Europe, kind of like an upswing of right-wing forces, right-wing organizing. The government that was in power for basically for up to like a year from now, a year from today, was a really conservative nationalist government that went down in like a pretty spectacular way a couple of like basically a year ago. And so that's kind of like there's like the problem, the problem of the fact that it's a really right-wing place. That is something that I think that labor unions and other people who are really pro-social housing really struggle with. And at the same time, there's the problem of the neoliberal turn. So there's a lot of pressure from the kind of like the bigger entity of the European Union to weaken renters' rights and to liberalize the land market within the country. And just like everywhere else, just like in New York and in cities around Vienna, like Berlin, they are also seeing land speculation in the small part of the market that is unregulated. And that pressure is putting the social housing system at risk just because people are realizing that they could make money. And that kind of creates a problem of like, well, we have a bunch of land that is tightly regulated, and what if we deregulate it? So that's kind of like there, but less so than other cities in Europe for sure. Next slide. So I'm gonna stop talking about Vienna for the time being, and we're gonna move into the panel portion of the evening. And our panelists are basically, we have 5 people who went on the delegation and could talk a little bit more about what we saw, what are the things that we liked, what are the things that we didn't like, and what are the kind of like the aspects of the trip that we could really bring back to New York City and New York State. So with us today are Julie Colon, who is the lead housing organizer at Northwest Bronx. We also have India Walton, who is the founder of the Fruitbelt Community Land Trust in Buffalo. We have Winsome Pendergrass, who is a leader at New York Communities for Change and Housing Justice for All. And Dorca Reynoso, who is the board member of Med Council Action, as well as Riddhi Singh, who is the communication manager at Housing Justice for All. So I'm going to start off with a big question for every panelist and ask you all for your main reflections about what we saw in Vienna and what you thought about the Viennese social housing system. And anyone can start.
I'll start. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. It was such an honor to be able to travel with Vienna with this delegation. I think my major takeaway was just how normal housing as a human right was, and the decommodification of housing. And it was like, well, how do you do this? And they're like, what do you mean? People need somewhere to live. And if the state wouldn't do it, then we did it as a city. And it was just such an ingrained part of the culture. Like the assumption is that people have a decent place to live. So I think like that was my major takeaway. And also just like how long that arc is and how much work that we have to do around the narrative about who deserves to be housed, which is all people, as opposed to like, you just don't work hard enough. So.
For me, I guess hi everyone. the main takeaway is how really doable this is, and how they said this many times, how they keep selling us this narrative, how it can't be done and how expensive it is, when in reality, in Vienna, they save about over $1 billion a year, or euros, I believe, by making the rent affordable, which then people can invest back into the economy. And just by that, people have such a different quality of life that we absolutely deserve. And that's what's ingrained in my brain. Like, I need to say it over and over again so people understand that we deserve this, and we just continue to repeat it so everybody gets that we deserve to have these beautiful homes and have a life that allows us to actually be human beings that can create and can live a different type of life, instead of being afraid and feeling like we need to live in this wheel to work and work and work, and not just be people who can just be human beings and lead beautiful lives that can be creative and just beautiful.
Oh, Winston, you're on mute.
Or your audio isn't working. Oh no.
I guess I'll hop on while we try to fix, wait, are you there, Winston? No, we can't hear you yet.
Julie, do you want to go ahead? I think that
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, good evening, y'all. So I think like the biggest takeaway for me was like how heavily sought after like public housing was, like, because essentially, right, like social housing is public housing. I grew up in public housing like my whole life. Like generationally, like my great grandparents like moved into the development of Bronx that I'm from. So I think that was like the biggest thing for me, right? Like growing up, having like friends tell me I can't go to your house because like my parents don't, want me to go to the projects or don't want me to go to like public housing. And how like people look at it as like the lowest of the low, right? And it's like something that's not sought after. And everybody, like not everybody, but like pretty much most of the population out there in Vienna lives in social housing. So yeah, I think that was like the biggest takeaway for me, like that people really, really wanted it. And that was really, really beautiful.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. So going to Vienna was really good. It's a lesson learned. It's as I've said to a few people, is that the concept of housing is ingrained into the minds of the politician, and they really think about the land, that it's not for this private developer, it is for the people. So, the stock of land that the city takes into control, it then goes back to the people. And so whatever is the whatever the nationals are thinking about, it is really about the residents, and it's really about the quality of life for the people who lives in Vienna. And we are not saying that it was this perfect utopia, because we were just there for a number of days, and I'm sure if we scratched a little harder, we would have seen some dirt. But for the mere fact that we can see that the housing situation is great. When we hear people saying, we ask the question, how long does it take for you for a repair? And they said 24 hours. We're like, what? You get your repairs done in 24 hours? It was really, really interesting to hear something like that.
I think I just want to add also, I think something that felt really different. So I live in Rochester in upstate, and it's a tenant majority city. So 2/3 of the residents in Rochester are tenants, but our government doesn't act like it, right? Our government caters in Rochester to like real estate developers and landlords and like people who don't even really live in our city. So it's not just, but that's very different from Vienna, which is also like a tenant majority city. And it's not just about majority, like the Viennese government took tenants seriously as like a group of people that like the parties have to actually like actively cater to and meet the needs of. And that felt really, really different for me as like an upstate tenant. You know, the idea that like, you know, obviously people getting the repairs done faster, but also like spectrum of services that are available to people. If you live in private housing, they had like, I don't know if anyone here is a tenant organizer, you know, there's like, or just even a tenant, there's a lot of conflict in your building. Oftentimes, they had like free conflict mediation services and like that people use. So tenants had a lot of amenities and services and all these things, and because it was understood that like the parties have to meet the needs of tenants, and tenants were organizing into these parties, and so it's a very different system than like what I'm used to in Rochester, where I feel like, you know, like I'm an afterthought.
Thank you all so much for that. I want to pick up on something that India mentioned about housing as a human right being kind of an ingrained part of the culture. So what would you all say about how the narrative about what housing is? How is it different in Vienna than what we find in New York State, in the US? And what can we do to shift the way that we talk about housing and we think about housing to make it more similar to what happens in Vienna? And again, anyone can start.
I think for me, in a way, would be like their housing system doesn't like other people. Like 80% of their residents qualify for it, because you can go not just from low income, like middle income people also qualify, and it's not just people like in Mitchell-Lama, like type developments. So by us maybe dedicating a specific tax amount each pay cycle, right? And sort of mimicking that model and making sure that most people, of course, not people with a high income qualify, and not sort of like segregating people based on income. Because it's like Julie says, it's like, oh, you live in housing, I don't want to deal with you. You live in this neighborhood, and not segregating the social housing to certain neighborhoods where like, well, I don't want to go to that neighborhood. I want to deal with those people. I think that would make a big difference. And of course, our elected officials need to be held accountable. Like they need to understand what their role is. Because if we continue to allow them to work for real estate and not do what is right for their constituents, it's just not going to change.
Yeah, I would say that like people, you know, kind of like spoke to it already. Like the narrative out there is that like housing is a human right, you know, and it is deeply ingrained. Their elected officials believe it. Like people are really aware of like their history and like where their housing came from as well. I would say in terms of like how we can shift the narrative, you know, I believe that the Our Homes Our Power like platform that like Housing Justice for All is currently fighting for is not going to be like the be all and end all and lead us to like the perfect social housing model, but it is like the, you know, some of the really important like building blocks, right? Like with the housing access voucher program, making sure that, you know, people get access to vouchers that'll lead them to get like permanent housing. With TOPA, like the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which will give like tenants the right to purchase their building or the right to refuse it, which gives us so much like more resident control, tenant control, you know, actually like gives people the opportunity to be like owners, you know, so there, and, you know, and the other bills that we're fighting for as well, like good cause eviction, the rent stabilization reform bill. So I think like us fighting for that platform, us like really winning in 2023, will like help us, you know, set us up to shift that.
There was a good takeaway for me was while we were in Vienna and we went to do a tour of the Karl Marx Hof building, and there was a young college student who was our tour guide, and it was a very nice guy. He told us the story. 22 years of age, and he just moved out of his parents' house, and he got a one-bedroom apartment, excuse me, for himself while he's in college. And he told us that his rent was like 300 euros. He's a young student. And I think of so many students back here, or young people back here in America, who can't leave out of their parents' house or their parents' basement, because what is happening in New York, it is just unconscionable. They can't even think of starting a family for themselves or really live a stress-free life. And I know a lot of people are saying, we are trying to make Vienna out to be this big fluff or whatever. We're not trying to make it to be a fluff. We're trying to see the good things that social housing does for them and how we can incorporate that into the lives of people here in New York. And I think it's about time for us to flip the tree, put the roots up to the sun, and just start all over again. Because if the government won't admit that they have failed, then we have to show them, yes, you have failed, but we are ready to start over, move along with something which seems to be a little more balanced.
I just want to add like one last thing is, so I think that like the way we define social housing is when municipalities or even state or federal government like makes major investments in creating units. But I think a part of what I noticed about Vienna is like the housing is actually social, right? Like it's built for people to be in community. Folks are engaged in their tenant associations, their walkable neighborhoods, there are kindergartens and doctor's offices and grocery stores, like all within walking distance, like right on site. So I think that like in addition to like thinking of social housing as to like how it's financed and structured, right? Like that social bond that is created when you have really beautiful, walkable neighborhoods where people feel like they're in community with one another is also why like it gets to be so well maintained and beautiful, because people actually are able to have a sense of pride in where they live. So I just wanted to add that also.
I absolutely agree with India. It's like when you feel like you're taken into consideration, like for mothers, if a sidewalk is designed so you can properly walk around with your stroller with your child, the building has proper green areas and things for you, like you're going to work and there's a daycare in the building, you don't have to struggle to take the kid, across town. It's a huge difference. Once you see that your money is being invested a certain way, the young guy that Winsome was mentioning, it's like ingrained in my brain, because like I have a son that's in his 20s and he can't live in this, like he can afford an apartment. He can't even afford a room in New York anymore. And we expect kids here to be responsible, develop. We want to reduce crime, but we don't provide young people in this city with the opportunity to do those things. This young man had such a level of maturity and the tools to like actually get a proper education and not be in debt. As soon as he was ready to be on his own, he was able to do that without having to wait for an application for going to Housing Connect and wait to maybe if somebody felt like it and when they felt like it for him to get that application. It took no time. So people are able to develop as normal human beings. Like the cycle of life, it's like a normal thing. So it's insane. Like, yeah, I just can't. That part gets me emotional.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go to this question actually. So, did it seem like the people that we talked to had like an awareness that their situation was special? And if they did, was it the affordability? Was it like the fact that things are well planned and actually considered of people? Or was it something else?
I don't know if I would say that they thought it was special as it was normal. It's deserved. It's not like a special thing. I don't know if you guys disagree, but I think it's just a normal thing to them. I don't know.
I think they were shocked, but we're coming from America, the richest country in the world, and we're coming there and asking them all these questions. I see they're giving us some side eyes, like, oh, you want social housing? You want to take? Well, a few of them were, move along with us. They say, we'll stay in Vienna. We're not coming to America. So I guess we show our hands as to how bad housing really is here in New York.
I think there was also a very acute awareness of the political power of tenants and labor and organizing, right? They were like, housing is our priority, and if our electeds don't do it, we vote them out and put people in who will.
Exactly.
I think that they were very honest about, like, their housing is a human right, but it's because they force the issue, right? Like, neoliberalism and the market is creeping in, but there are so many ways policy wise that they're able to stabilize housing prices, and it is because the political will exists, right? And I think that their leadership knows that if they don't, I hate the word comply, but like if they don't do something about it, then like their office is at risk.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, I remember a specific experience where we were at one of the presentations, and we just had, I think it was one of the tenants' rights groups, and we just had so many questions around, like, do people get evicted, and what's the process for that, and is there like money for people that happens to, and like, what about if this happens with your landlord and that happens with your landlord? And like Winston said, they were kind of like looking at us like, again, there's like super strong like tenants' rights that probably like wouldn't happen, and if it did happen, here's like what happened before and like how it won't happen again. So it was just like really like ingrained into the system and into people's like heads that like they kind of like already were like entitled to it. Like, I know I'm supposed to have a home, so like, and I know like if something happens to it, that like there's other things in the system that'll protect me.
And one of the thing that threw us too was when we asked the question, when politicians take bribes or they and the question was asked, why would they take bribes? We asked the question again, what would be the treatment, if politicians started doing underhanded things? And they say point blankly, prisons in Austria are not very nice. So I guess they mean business. And they saying, we shout the word housing is a human right here, and I think people take it for granted, but I can see that in Vienna it is etched in stone. Housing is a human right, and we have seen firsthand that the unions in Vienna, they really take care of their workers. We scouted out an area one morning, and you can see the railway work buildings built, and it's etched the year it was built by the Railway Workers Union, the Fire Workers Union, the Teachers Workers Union, the Radio Workers Union, and it tells you the year they commenced the project and when it ends. And as you walk through that, maybe 15 block radius, you see that the unions really take care of their workers. They house their workers.
And that's a great thing about that I loved about Vienna. Like, you don't have to, every worker is able to be part of a union. They're not great when it comes to immigration. Like, you have to, it takes forever for you to maybe become a citizen, if ever. But if you're working, you can be part of a labor. So that's amazing. But again, that whole thing with everyone being able, except for high income people, to be able to participate in this program, makes it so everyone really can care. Like, if from low income to middle income people are able to partake in this, everyone really has a stake. And if people, you're able to envision in you being able to enjoy this, and you being able to have live in an apartment that has a pool and a sauna, And it's not just for other people. It just makes a huge difference. It's just only wealthy people are really not able to participate. So you have that mixed income component that makes it accessible for everyone.
I did like talk to a couple of like tenants living in the private market, right outside of social housing. And like, while it wasn't quite as bad as what we deal with here in New York State, you know, there's still some issues that people were experiencing. And there's like a very big difference between what the private market tenants were saying versus people living in social housing. But the thing that the private market tenants did have is like universal rent control. So even though that they weren't living in social housing, that comes with a lot of protections and investment and all these things, at the very least, they had the basic protection, like basic tenant protections and like universal rent control. So at the very least, the costs were kept under control. And that also helped like the land prices stay in control. So it had like this kind of like double benefit.
So to pick up on something that both Winsome and Dorka brought up, you all are organizers in New York City, New York State, and do work with tenants, and maybe do other types of organizing as well. Actually, I know that some of you do. So how was the organizing culture different in Vienna? What were the big differences? How do people push for collective change that's different from what we do in the city and in the state here?
I think the organizing power in Vienna is ingrained in workers' mind. I think they realize and know that nothing will be achievable unless they pull together and work towards a common goal. As I said before, I wish we had more time to really go in depth with some of these people and to know what some of the tactics they use or how they really hold their officials accountable. But I think being as it is a system that has been in operation for a long time, I think they really have themselves organized and demand what they want from the politicians. And then because the politician then has to deliver, because there is no other way for them than to deliver what the tenant is asking for. And who here who even have the concept, the longer you live in a building, your rent gets lower? That got to be some serious negotiation. That got to be some serious planning and thinking, because as we know, they take this huge profit margin out of the housing. It's not lining one particular group of people's pocket, because when they make whatever they get back their investment, whatever is made over, they have to put it back into the building stock. So I think they have no other alternative than to really keep supplying the demands of the tenants.
It also seemed to me like the political party was doing like a lot of the organizing, right? And that's, I think, how they're able to remain where they are, but also they're like safeguarding the rights of the people, because it's also convenient. Well, it's also convenient, I think, for them. But it seems like the socialist party is doing. I mean, I didn't see people protest. Well, I saw one protest, but it wasn't from the right, from the right group, I would say. But yeah, I think from where I saw it, most of the organizing is being done from the Socialist Party, and I guess the labor unions.
Yeah, sorry, you go ahead, India. One of the buildings that we toured, so one thing that kind of kept coming up for us were like, where are the tenant organizers, right? So like the way that in New York State, we have a lot of tenant organizers, kind of some of us in nonprofit, some of us in like independent formations, trying to organize buildings and stuff. We were trying to find something like that's like that, and it didn't really exist, and that was kind of confusing for a bit. But as we were touring some of the buildings, one of the social housing developments that we looked at, the Social Democrats Party had like an office that like tenants were actually being organized into like the party rather than as like a kind of independent group. So there's a lot more, yeah, like party-based organizing as opposed to just kind of the more like nonprofit-based or like independent stuff that we have in the US. And that like kind of, I think connects to what I was saying earlier about how like then like the party and their government is like deeply accountable to tenants. Tenants are being like organized into it as like as a group. So I think that was really interesting. And then one of the other things that they have is like the Austrian Chamber or the Viennese Chamber of Labor, that like every worker is automatically a part of. So in addition to like unions, there's like this bigger, I don't know, I can't remember if it's like governmental officially or if it's like from the government, but like there's this like these like institutions that like people are organized into that and it's like automatic and that like represent people that, and that's like something that's very foreign to us with like our really low union density and like the really kind of limited level of like kind of organizing that we have here, and the like difference we have in terms of like how much do people participate and organize within, and like how do people, everyday people, like navigate like our political parties. So it's very different, and like took a while to understand that. I think I was like, I think we're like movement people, and we had a really diverse delegation, and Vienna was very not diverse, and like I think our movement culture is really different too. But yeah, people just have like different like institutions that they organize into and different organizing conditions that translate to like a very different, both their organizing is different and like their outcomes end up pretty different.
Yeah, I was just I want to lift up a few things that you said. One of them is like Vienna is pretty homogenous, right? Like most people, have this long history. Everyone sort of looks the same, it's a bunch of white folks, and like you don't get into sort of like this oppression Olympics about who deserves more of what or when, right? Like it's just it's easier to organize when your ideologies align so closely. The other thing that I found really interesting is, like you said, like tenants are organized into the political party, and a few times for me it came up that like our reliance on this 501c3 tax code is crippling us. Because although we can use nonprofits to organize tenants and organize movements, when it comes to actually holding an elected official accountable, then it's like, well, we might be crossing the line now, right? So like the organizations that have large bases and have power are afraid to speak out because they don't want to lose their tax status and consequently their funding and all of those things. So I think that like finding a way to work around organizing necessarily through nonprofits and like getting directly back to our grassroots is going to be really critical in this housing justice movement.
I just want to add one thing too that I found interesting out there. So the Socialist Democratic Party out there actually like works with conservative party as well. And I'm not saying that like tomorrow, like Democrats and Republicans will like come together and like kumbaya, but they have a certain like agreement, right? That like both sides need to get something for their people, right? And so like, how do we work together to make sure that happens? But there's still like really strong tenant protections. There's still really strong like accountability to the tenants. And there's still like that like really long history of like organizing, right? And political power. So that was something that I also thought was like really interesting of like, how do we bring that out here, right? Like, how do we find like people who may not be like, okay, we may not be best friends with them, but like, we need you, you need us. And like, how do we work together to like, shift the system in that way? So I think that was like an important takeaway too.
Let's talk about the other side of the coin for a second. What were some of the social challenges that you all observed while we were in Vienna, and how do you think they influence the way that social housing functions and its future in the city?
For me, it was problematic how they were actually, not necessarily directly in Vienna, but they did have an issue with the asylum seekers or migrants, like making them, they were building tents in some areas, which was pretty awful to me. But yeah, and some people in our group were experiencing issues with racism, and that definitely plays out in, I guess, in all areas, not just in housing, but the immigration thing was definitely, the asylum seekers being treated differently is definitely problematic.
Well, meeting with the president of the Black Lives Matter over there in Vienna was very eye-opening. It was a raw session for us all because once again, wherever you go, people with the darker hue is being treated unfairly or, singled out and not given the respect that they're due. But one of the takeaway from her is that, well, she is a national, so because her mother is a national of Vienna, she is, I don't want to say it's a a privilege, but she is counted in the census because of her parentage and stuff like that. But it was interesting to hear her say, with all the upheavals and all the different things when it comes down to people of color, she felt safer in the social housing than in opposed to the other housings that were around. And we can really see the sense of community within, whatever housing complex that we visited. Um, we visited one which the land was one of the largest train depot, so to speak, where trains used to leave out to go to Italy and the rest of Europe. But they transformed that into such a lovely, beautiful space. The tenants also have a say into the material that was used into their homes. Developers, which was taken into account. Making our way to the rooftop, you can see the sense of community, the community kitchen, the kindergarten space for the babies, the climbing wall for babies, the art that is displayed, the mini library on the roof. And we saw a gentleman relaxing on a beanbag, having a glass of wine. And I keep saying, "Do you all smell bread?" And then we see he came into the kitchen and he took his bread out. And there was the herb garden there and, little blueberry tree or whatever. So there was a sense of community there, the green space. And each person's door you pass, they have their own little, garden or tomato plant or whatever. But the whole fact of the matter is that the old area is made for the people, by the people. So is that a form of democracy right there I'm talking about? Okay, I guess so, in the housing. And for somebody to create a city and have no cars running in the center of that area, somebody has the vision and the mind to say, let's take into account the health of our people. So the cars will drive on the outer peripheral, but not in the middle of the complex. So much thought is put into it. So it's a real sense of community, of taking care of the elderly, the middle age, the babies. It was interesting, and it's really heartening to see that.
I think it was particularly frustrating at times though, because when we ask questions about like the rates of homelessness and the demographics, like who gets apartments and how long do they wait, the answer was kind of like, we don't know, we don't track it, right? So like that part of it was like, all of this is great, like who doesn't want a pool on their rooftop? But like, how fair and equitable is the system actually if you're not collecting data and making that data public so people can see exactly how this is operating?
And also on the building that Winsome is speaking about, it's great. I mean, the building was beautiful, and the model was amazing, but then the fact that people there, they did a great thing. Like they had, I believe it was 5 units that they dedicated to asylum seekers. But to me, aside from, yeah, it's great, the fact that that's being commended is because it's rare. And if it's rare, it's a problem. You know what I mean? So it's, yeah, like I was happy that they were doing that, but if I have to commend you for it, it's because it's not being done enough. So yeah, that's the one issue that I had with that. Like I loved it. I was like over the moon with it, but that was problematic for me.
One last thing, I know we have to wrap up, but in the public-private and the limited profit model, like you still needed quite a bit of capital to buy into it, right? So like when you expect people to come up with large lump sums of money just to get in, like that in and of itself is inherently going to be classist, racist, atheist, right? Like where does this capital come from to buy in to the limited profit model? So that was one other thing that was just kind of like, you know, in the pursuit of true equity, it just didn't seem like that was at the forefront of what they're trying to do in Vienna.
And one thing on that also is that like when the rents go up, they're like based on the inflation. So if inflation is like, let's say 10%, then your rent is going to go up 10%. Not on social housing, but on the, what is it? The limited
profit.
Yeah, so that's on the private market. That's pretty high. Like, I mean, the way that inflation is in some places now, that's pretty crazy. If your rent is going up by 7% or 10%, I mean, it could be a lot for many of us.
So this is I feel like this is a good place for us to stop with like, you know, some ambivalence, some questions, being realistic about the fact that this is a place in the world. Let's take a couple of audience questions now before we move on to the next section of the program. Sia or Sumati, is one of you going to be?
I'm texting them. I'm DMing them to you. I'm DMing
Okay. I see. Okay. Okay, cool. So first question is, how is the city dealing with issues of sustainability and greening? And where is the money coming for that?
Good job. Repeat that.
The question was how, so there's kind of like this established social housing system that's been around for 100 years, but now we have the problem of climate change. And how is the city and how is the social housing system adapting to climate change and dealing with sustainability?
I'll tell a story. So don't make me tell you the name of the river, but anyway, every year the river floods.
Blue Danube. The Blue Danube.
So the councilwoman comes to talk to us about the Danube, and she's like, the Danube kept flooding. We were like, what are we supposed to do? So they built an island in the Danube with a public garden with fruit-bearing trees. So now not only is it reducing the flooding, but there's also more green space. There's also like free food where people can just go access it. Another example was there was a cholera outbreak or something and the water was contaminated. Well, they found a spring and, you know, tapped the spring. So now like the tap water in Vienna is coming from a natural spring and it's also more energy efficient. So I think that like, while we are actively trying to undo all of the pollution and harms that we cause that are causing our climate crisis, like the people of Vienna have sort of always had this other consciousness about like a need to protect the environment. I think about their public transit system. A public transit pass is $365 for the entire year. You can get anywhere in the city. There's not too many cars. Like you can walk most places that you need to get necessities. So I think that it's just been like a different sort of mindset. And the last thing was just like, there's a tax. That's how, like, people just pay into the system that creates the housing. And everyone who works pays into it. And, you know, everyone up to 80% of the median income is able to also access the benefits of that. So I think like we've said a lot of times, it's just a totally different mindset when it comes to how community cares towards people.
Right, but with the land use, I believe they say they keep like 49% green, and 36% for like they're able to build on only 36% of the land use, and 15% I think was for the for traffic. So they make sure that the green areas remain. Between what they build and traffic, it's approximately 50-50, and they're not going over that. So that makes a huge difference as to what we do here, where we're trying to destroy all green areas.
One more question. Curious to hear more about how rents go down over time, what mechanisms allow for that, and is it replicable in New York City or New York State? So I could address this one. The limited housing profit model, the way that it's set up is essentially like, this is going to be an oversimplification, but basically in the same way that a home mortgage is set up, like if you buy a single family home, ostensibly, if you pay it off and you don't take on any more debt or withdraw more equity, your housing payment is going to go down. And with the limited housing profit association, that's like those are the private entities that own a lot of the non-municipal housing complexes that are still social housing. Once the construction loan is paid off, so once the amount of money that it took to actually like build the building is paid off, the rents go down, and the rents just cover what it takes to operate the housing. And anything in excess of that, I think anything above 3.5% or something goes into like a fund that then contributes to further construction of social housing. That is very much not like what happens with affordable, like kind of like basic affordable housing in the US, where there's profit to be made on affordable housing, especially in New York, because land is expensive, but in other places as well. So all of the extra money gets put into a landlord's pocket. So rents, there is not an incentive for rents to go down because the landlord is always going to make money there, because there's legal guardrails where like that's just impossible because of the way that these housing associations are set up. That's what happens. And it makes sense. And I remember like being completely shocked by this. And I think like lots of us, when we heard that in the room, were also shocked by this. But then like the people who were presenting to us in their like kind of like very like even Austrian way were like, but like you paid off the loan. So why would you pay more money? So yeah, like it's like once you remove kind of the unfortunate American veneer of the way that real estate functions here, it does make sense. So I think that maybe in the interest of time, we should move on to the next portion. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. You all were awesome, and I hope that the audience got to learn a little bit more from all of you. And I think we could go back to the slideshow now.
1 second, sorry.
No, it's cool.
Okay. We're back at the slideshow. Cool.
So we're obviously not going to get to 70% social housing from what we have in New York now. We're not, I should say that despite the fact that everything is seems absolutely terrible with like the first slide that Sia covered with $4,000 rents in Manhattan and over 260,000 eviction filings in our court system right now. We're not at zero. We do have legacy social housing stock in New York that we should be proud of. The core of it is the New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, which is deeply affordable. It's something like 178,000 units. And then we have things like Mitchell-Lama housing, HDFCs, all sorts of different limited equity co-ops that were created over the course of the last like 60, 75 years. So there's a base to work from, and we have a rent control system, a rent regulation system that was strengthened just a couple of years ago. But there is much more to win, obviously. I wanted to highlight a report that the organization that I work for, the Community Service Society, put out a couple of months ago that covers 20 different policies that would shift our housing landscape towards social housing. And we go through these 20 policies are kind of split up into 4 different sections. 2 of them are pretty obvious. So creating laws that take private housing and move it towards social housing. So that's like the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act that you're going to hear about in a second, and more money for these type of housing programs. But at the same time, the other 2 aspects of housing law and housing programs that we cover are tenants' rights and protections and code enforcement. And those 2 may seem like they're kind of removed from social housing, but one of the main takeaways for me from going to Vienna was really realizing that the fact that they have very strong rent control is completely tied to the way that social housing functions and the fact that social housing is able to function there, because tenants are able to organize, and tenants are able to kind of be able to push their rights because they're protected, and because rent regulation makes it more difficult to speculate on land, and therefore makes social housing construction possible. So we could go to the next slide, and I'm gonna hand it over to Assemblymember Emily Gallagher, who's gonna talk a little bit about how we move towards social housing in New York State.
Thank you, Oksana. It's been so great to listen to all of my friends that I made on this trip. And it was really an incredible opportunity for folks who are on all sides of this issue to come together and to think through, and we're continuing to think through, what does the future of housing look like? And the biggest thing is that we have all adjusted to the mindset that this is a long fight, and it is a long fight that is worth fighting. So as so many have said, like Dorka and Winsome were mentioning, there is a different mindset about housing in Vienna, because the concept that it is a human right in Vienna is totally removes it from being commodified. And here in the New York State government, we sometimes say that housing is a human right, but we're perfectly comfortable with commodifying it. So one of the things that we really need to do is shift from this mindset of scarcity to abundance, which is something that is going to be critical, that there is enough housing for everyone. Everyone can live in a safe and beautiful environment. And this is something that without housing, people struggle, people die, and there's no stability. And that is really what puts good, strong housing policy at the center of public safety. So we need to build the coalition that they have in Vienna, which is with labor. And as you heard, in Vienna, they don't just have unions, they also have unaffiliated workers who are represented by an association that bargains at the table for them. And they actually are the counterpart to the Chamber of Commerce. So they have the commercial side and the labor side bargaining together and working together. We need to really mobilize all the tenants. I represent a district, District 50, that is 82% tenant. And as an elected official, I am still a tenant myself, and I've been a tenant my entire adult life. So I know that the tenant aspect is a huge part of my community's concern. And it's critical that all of you make it known that you are a huge part of your elected representatives' concerns. And then electoral party building. It is true that in Vienna, the Socialist Democratic Party is delivering and has delivered results that are not just a thought experiment or so intangible that people can't see it and feel it every day. When you have your home that is owed to a strong electoral movement, then you are physically connected to that movement. So we really have to make it known what it is that a strong political movement can provide. And so all of these things work in tandem, and that is what we are building. And that's what Housing Justice for All has done such a great job building. So there's many things that are taken for granted in Vienna, like rent control, like, the right to a house. And that is something that we don't have here, right? We are constantly in competition for housing and for affordability. So the first steps in our long path to social housing is our Homes, Our Power campaign. And this is something really exciting that if you're not already involved in, I hope you will all get involved. And I say that as an elected official who is fighting on the inside to have these policies passed. This campaign has three main policies: good cause eviction, which gives all tenants the right to have power to organize and will help grow our movement. The housing voucher, the Housing Access Voucher Program, HAVP, which is rental assistance to stabilize our community and in the future will help fund rents for tenants living in social housing. And the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, which will allow tenants to have a shot at converting their privately owned building to resident-controlled social housing if the building owner is interested in selling it. So all three of these are building blocks towards a social housing development authority. And I am very excited to say that my office and many of the policy wonks that went on this trip, who are so talented, are working together to craft a social housing development authority bill. And this bill is still in process, but I can tell you it is really exciting to envision what a different system could look like in New York State. So stay tuned for that, but I'm going to turn it over to you all to play the video. I think we need the sound. Or I'm not hearing this one.
Sí, puedo yo.
Housing is at the top of Albany's agenda this year. What's at stake for New Yorkers?
Sí, puedo yo quedarme aquí en el barrio que tanto me gusta.
Whether I'm able to secure a roof over my head or I have to sleep on the street.
It's about who New York will be for.
Rent prices have exploded across the country.
Will New York be a playground for the rich or a place where working class New Yorkers can make it?
For being in the shelter for 3 years, we deserve rental assistance for everybody.
I have been living in my apartment in Flatbush for 28 years. Without stronger tenant protection, I will become a stranger in my own community.
Our city and our state are facing an existential crisis.
It's urgent that we pass the good cause eviction bill that will protect families across New York State from retaliatory evictions and outrageous rent increases.
Our solution to the housing crisis is to center the people who are struggling the most.
We have from now until the budget is done, to put tenants and homeless New Yorkers first.
It's all on the line. Corporate landlords may have the money, but we have the people.
Message your elected official and tell them to support the Our Homes, Our Power platform.
5 transformational bills that will ensure all New Yorkers have access to stable housing.
So I hope you're riled up from that awesome video with so many of my colleagues in it and so many of the people that you saw here and so many more people who are in this movement. And I'm really here to invite you to be a participant if you are not already, and to get the people that live near you or that are having experiences that are telling you their stories, to make that a message to your elected official. Learn who represents you, learn who you need to contact, and make your story, your personal story, heard. Because I know that when I am in Albany and when I'm in my district office, my priority has to be the people who live in my district. You are our bosses. And sometimes when there's not a lot of communication between the residents of an area and the elected official, it's like the boss is on vacation and people, are just hanging out and not doing the work that they need to do for you. So make sure that they are hearing your story from you. And there's so many different ways that you can do that. You can, I know Housing Justice for All has a program that helps you send emails. I personally recommend you visit your elected official or you call them. Make it personal for them. Let them know how much housing matters to you. Because right now, if they're not hearing from you, then they're only hearing from the lobbyists, from the real estate developers. They're hearing from the wealthy people who are giving them money, and they're centering their decisions on those folks. So help us recenter the conversation around what will preserve the tenants in New York State, which is housing justice and which is the pathway to social housing. So I am really excited. I think you should look up these bills as they're being introduced. We're sometimes still getting our bill numbers on right now this year, but look online, see who's carrying the bill, see who's already signed on as a co-sponsor. And if you don't see your elected official on there, you need to contact them and make it known that it is not okay for them to not stand up for you in Albany, and that you'll remember and that you'll vote. So, or your friend will vote or something like that. So I am really excited to keep working on this. I'm really excited at the point that we're ready to reveal what so many folks on this team have collaborated on, which will be a social housing development authority for New York State. And I am so proud to be a part of this coalition. And I want to thank all the organizers for including me. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you everybody for coming today. Just like a reminder, the very first step for helping us win this fight and joining in this movement to build towards a future of social housing is this tool, hj4a.org/take-action. It's in the chat. You just fill out the form. It will send a letter to your rep. That's just the first step, right? So we'll be going to Albany. We are doing actions in district. We are tenant organizing. We're organizing. Homeless folks are organizing. So we have a really big, robust movement across the state. But the very first simple thing that you can do is go to hj4a.org/take-action. We will be, I know we didn't get to all the questions. We're going to keep tomorrow night, or, I don't know, tomorrow night's Friday night, but sometime tomorrow, we're going to send out this recording as well as answers to the questions that we didn't get to and some of the resources that we shared tonight. So stay tuned for that. And I think there's a lot of really great and thoughtful questions. So we appreciate everybody for coming and for participating. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Sia and Oksana. Thank you to Emily, Assembly Member Gallagher. So have a good night, everybody.